Hi everyone, in this video we are going to understand a very important topic, that is load balancer. And in the previous video we have already seen how a single server architectures work and how we can scale our setup either horizontally or vertically. So let's start the topic. So we are already aware that, let's say there is a client using our website or the mobile application. So if they initiate a request, the request is passes on to the DNS, right? And the DNS return the IP address of that particular domain name, and then the request passes on to the server. But in this case we are using horizontal scaling. Rather than using a single server, we are using multiple servers. So in this case, in this example here, as you can see, we are using two servers, right? So if we forget this part, just forget this part. So let's just imagine that user initiate a request. If the user initiate a request, the request is passes on to the DNS, and DNS return the IP address of this particular domain name to the client. And then the thing is ki in this case we are using two servers here, right? Then how the client will decide, now as we have got the IP address, now this request should pass to which server? Who will decide, like to server 1 or to server 2? Because in the initial setup where we were using single server setup, there was only single server, so request will must go to that server. But in this case, if we ignore this part, we have only two servers. Now which server the request should pass on, to the server 1 or to the server 2? Who will decide? So we have something known as load balancer. Now by the name you can understand that something that can balance the load, now what load? So as we have understood the problem exists here is, if we are using a multiple servers, now who will decide to which server the request will pass on? So there is a software or a hardware that comes up in the picture, that is load balancer. So load balancer can be a hardware or a software which basically distribute the load among the servers. Basically load balancer will decide, if we are using horizontal scaling, means we are using multiple servers, so load balancer will decide to which server the request should pass on. Okay, so first let's understand the whole setup. As we have understood, load balancer is something who will decide to which server the request should pass on, right? Okay, so let's say I am using multiple server. In this case I am using two servers, right? Okay, so same setup, a request is initiated and the request is passes on to the DNS, right? But if you remember the case of single server setup, in single server setup, what do we have? In single server setup, let's say there is a client, let's say this is the client, and client make a request of mysite.com, and this domain is passes on to the DNS, and the DNS will return the IP address of that domain name. Why? Because it is already registered, this record is already created or configured in the DNS. So for this domain name mysite.com, it is mapped to this, let's say 88.88 something, this IP address, right? But remember, see, in this case, if we are using multiple servers, right? Now if we are using multiple servers, so when a request is initiated for mysite.com, see what IP address will DNS will return, because in this case in single server setup we have the IP address of that single server only. But in this case, as we have two servers, now what IP address do DNS will return, because we have two servers, right? But the domain name should map to only one IP address, right? So in this case what we do, when we use a load balancer is a system or software. So what we do, when we know that in this set when we know that okay, we have to switch to horizontal scaling, and if we are switching to horizontal scaling, we have to use a load balancer. So we have to configure the IP address of load balancer in the DNS. So what we are going to do, first in the DNS we will make a record that for mysite.com this IP address should be passed to the client. Now this IP address is pointed to load balancer. It basically means the request is not going directly to the servers. The request is first passes to the load balancer, right? So this IP address is the address of load balancer. It means it is public IP address. It is available to the client because client make a request, and we have already configured this that for this domain name this IP address should be written, and this IP address is pointed to the load balancer. So in this case, in this setup, horizontal scaling setup, we are not directly passing the IP address of server to the client. No, we are using a middleman basically. So uska IP address we are passing to the client. Okay, so the request is initiated and this IP address of load balancer passes to this client. Now this IP address is public IP address. Now the client will passes the request to this load balancer. Okay, great. So the request is passes on to the this load balancer. Now the thing is कि load balancer has to decide to which server the request should pass on to. So as we have seen that we have to first configure the DNS, we also have to configure our load balancer. It basically means कि जितने भी server हम use कर रहे हैं, we have to mention their IP address. Like in load balancer, we have to mention the IP address of server 1, that is 10.001 and 10.0.02. So this way only load balancer know कि उसको रिक्वेस्ट कौन से सर्वर पर सेंड करनी है. हाउ, दिस इज़ अ वेरी डिफरेंट टॉपिक, बट in this case first we have to configure the IP address of that domain name for point to the load balancer, and once the request is passes on to the load balancer, we have to mention all the IP address of the servers we are using. Let's say कि अगर मैं एक और सर्वर यहाँ यूज़ करती हूँ, so I have to mention in this load balancer कि I have 3 servers, that is 10.0.01, 10.0.02 and 10.0.03. Okay, so now this load balancer know कि where the request has to be sent, on which server. So there are 3 servers and the request has to pass on any of these 3 servers, not to all of the 3 servers, any of the 3 servers, right? Okay, so these are private IP address. Why? Because client can't directly access this IP address. Only load balancer can access this this IP address. Okay, so now the request so the request is passes on to the load balancer. Now load balancer will decide. Let's say three user initiate a request, or 2 user, let's say request 1 or request 2. Now load balancer will decide how and on which server the request has to be sent. Let's say the request 1 is passes on to the first server and the request 2 is passes on to the server second. Let's say request 3rd is come, and again the third request is passes on to the first server. So there are different ways how load balancer shares or distribute the request among the servers, but the thing is that in this case this service is better than a single server architecture, because a single server architecture is a single point of failure. So we are using multiple servers. If we are using multiple servers, so there should be a middleman who will decide कि which server should passes on to the which request should passes on to the which server. So that's what load balancer does. That's the total job of the load balancer, and this is secure because we are not directly providing the IP address of our server to the client. We are just passing the IP address of our middleman, that is the load balancer. But in single server architecture, as we have only one server, so we don't have to use a load balancer, and the request is directly passes on to that server only because we have only one server, right? So we have to configure the load balancer, we have to mention that how many server we are using. We have to mention the IP address of that domain name in our DNS record. And the best part is, if we are as we are using horizontal scaling, we can like easily add one more server or multiple server in our this setup. Why? Because we just have to mention the server IP address in the load balancer. Let's say now I'm using 2 more servers, so I just have to mention the IP address of these 2 servers, right? Just these 2 servers, and the load balancer will automatically handle the request among these 5 servers, right? And how it like basically load balancer distributes the data, how it decide कि first request first server को जाएगी, second request second server को जाएगी. This is a different topic, we will like discuss in the next video, but this is the whole part of the load balancer. So load balancer is nothing, just like load balancer basically distribute the data among the servers, and it is easy. Why? We can easily add a new server, and we have to mention the IP address of that server. Security also play a vital role in this setup. Also, load balancer do one thing, it like continuously check the health of the server. Let's say what does the health basically means, health of the server? Let's say the server is get overloaded by the request. There are lots of requests on this server. So if this server overloaded, we have multiple servers. So what load balancer will do, it will continuously check the health of the system. If this system is getting overloaded, all the requests of this server is passes on to the second server. So our website will not be will be available to everybody. It will not shut down, okay, because we have multiple server. These server can serve the webs. This can serve the user, right? So that's why it is better, and it is easy to maintain. Maintenance easy here because we are using we are using multiple servers, and load balancer keeps check the health of the server, so we can make sure that which server is getting overloaded, on which server we have a huge amount of requests. So that's why we basically use the load balancers, right? Okay, so I hope you understood this concept of load balancer, the setup of this, right? So we are going to understand like how load balancer decide which request is passes on to the which server. Also one thing which we are going to look in the next video, that we are using only one load balancer, right? So if we get huge amount of request, all the request first passes on to this load balancer, and load balancer also can get overload, right? Because we have only one server. So this load balancer is also a single point of failure. If this load balancer gets down, now who will going to serve our request? Now serve basically means that who is going to pass on our request to these servers, right? So we are going to understand that in the next video, but I hope you understand the concept of load balancer, how what it does, and this setup. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.